we scored a last-minute campsite here at a very popular park, which proves the point that when the online reservation system says the campground is full, and when you drive up and the sign says campground is full, that doesn't mean you shouldn't call or drive in and ask them if they have a site. There were 3 available here last night.
Yeah.
And we scored one of them, so we're very lucky. Greetings from Dead Horse Point State Park, which is adjacent to Canyonlands National Park, both of which are in the general Moab, Utah area.
And we use this sort of as our base camp for a drive-by of Canyonlands National Park. Not really what we intended and not how we'd normally do a national park, and not because it is a drive-by park, but because that's all the time we had. And so it was sort of a drive-through. We'll get into that a little bit more, but this ended up being a really nice state park, and let's talk about why.
Yeah, this is a very popular state park. It's as beautiful and it has as many things to do almost as Canyonlands. So Utah State Park System is amazing, as you have heard us talk about if you've watched some of our videos. And when we checked, the online reservation system said this campground was full. We drove up, the sign said the campground was full, but I had called ahead just to find out, because we learned as camp hosts that sometimes you end up with an odd gap in the camping system where somebody's, camping for a few days, somebody else is camping for a few days, but there's a night in between. And when I called, they said they had 3 RV sites available, and I think a couple of tent sites, a couple of the yurts were still available. So it always pays to call ahead, even if everything says it's full, just to find out what's going on, and you might be able to score a site, at least for one night, which is all we needed.
And that's for sure. And especially here in Utah, because as we learned as camp hosts, Utah's online reservation system shuts down 2 days in advance. And so you have to call or do a like a walk-in, first come, first serve. And so this one paid off for us. We knew we were already coming to the area and we were just going to boondock out in BLM land, but Ari called and here we are. And I'm so glad we ended up here because it ended up being the perfect place for us to base camp from, but also for me to work from for a little bit.
Not only does this state park work as a perfect place to camp if you're going to do Canyonlands, but as I mentioned, Dead Horse Point State Park is a beautiful park in its own right. I mean, Dead Horse Point has kind of a sad history to it and how it got its name, but it's a beautiful area to go out and explore. I wish we had more time, not just for Canyonlands, but also for Dead Horse Point, because there's a lot of hiking trails here. There's a lot of beautiful things to see and experience, and I'm kind of sad that we're going to have to get going so quickly, but I'm glad we got to see what we did.
Well, and we'll make sure we come back. We already know Utah's going to be back on the list, and this will be back on our list for when we can come and we can hopefully book a reservation to stay for a good few days, a weekend at minimum, maybe a week, because I know Ari really wanted to come here because Thelma and Louise was filmed here, or parts of the movie were filmed here. So I know that was a big draw, but it is gorgeous. And because it does abut Canyonlands and then the general Moab area, you've got a lot to do around here. So I think, yes, we will put this on our list. And if you were putting this on your list, make sure that you book months in advance so that you can get a longer stay.
I commented yesterday while we were doing a quick tour of Canyonlands that ideally I'd say book a week for this area. What you need to remember is that Canyonlands is actually in 2 sections.
Well, there's actually 3 sections.
There's 3 sections, and they're in the Needle section and Island in the Sky, which is where we're at in that section of Canyonlands, are not connected. You have to go out and around. So,
and by out and around, it's a good 2 to 2.5 hours to get from each entrance. Yeah. It's not like a quick hop.
It's like 12 miles as the crow flies, or the raven in Utah, because they don't have crows, they have ravens. But you have to drive it. It's a long drive. So what I would suggest is go down and do Needles first. See if there's a place to stay down there somewhere. Spend a day or 2 doing that section. Then do your big drive around and come up and do the Island in the Sky section and see if you can stay here at Dead Horse Point State Park. That allows you a few days to check out this state park and the Island in the Sky unit of Canyonlands. I think that would be a great way to do it if you had the time to pull that off.
Well, and I would add, if you have a 4-wheel drive high clearance vehicle, then you can, and backpacking and all those other skills, go and do the maze section, because that section looks amazing. No pun intended. But that section looks really cool, but you have to know what you're doing out in the backcountry and have the right equipment and gear for that, because that is no joke. But yes, the Canyonlands area, I mean, I really had wanted to do Needles. I mean, all summer, that's what I wanted to do. And life just happened. We got busy. We had obligations at Fremont Indian State Park with our camp hosting. We had other stuff going on. And so we ended up with a drive-by of Canyonlands, and I feel so bad because we're not doing it justice to ourselves, to the park, to you. But we will be back.
Well, yeah, we usually try to do 3 to 4 days in a national park. We did 3 to 4 hours, but that's what a lot of people do. I mean, especially if you have folks that aren't living the RV life, and maybe you're out here and saying, "Hey, we only have the chance to kind of go by Canyonlands, but we're right here. Let's stop and do it." There's quite a bit to see. There is a scenic drive sort of through the park that has turnouts, and I think they said it's like 34 miles. It's less than 40 miles, but it's not one continuous drive. There's a main section, and then there's a couple of different spurs that you can drive off and see. So it really depends on which one of those you go see. There are numerous turnouts that you can just pull in and take a look at an overlook, get some beautiful pictures.
Oh, and those overlooks are amazing.
And
It just doesn't do it justice.
it doesn't. And you really get an idea. I didn't really know what to expect of Canyonlands. It's right near arches. So you're like, well, are there arches? Is the Needles? Are those like hoodoos at Bryce? Canyonlands, at least the island and the sky section, you're up on these mesas and you're on these overlooks and you're looking down into all of these canyons. There's just hundreds of them the way it's been carved between the Green River, the Colorado River, and everything else through time. It's just a really neat way to look down on it and see what nature has done over millions of years.
No matter how much time you have, always stop at the visitor center, grab the map and grab the little paper brochure that tells you if you have 1 hour, do this. If you have 3 hours, do this. If you have 8 hours, do this. And then talk to the ranger, which is what we did. And she gave us some suggestions on what we could see in our 3 to 4 hours. And that included a couple short hikes. And these were less than a mile hikes so that you could do them relatively quickly, even though they are uphill both ways. One of those is Mesa Arch, which is probably the most well-known feature here in Canyonlands. And it's maybe not as impressive as the arches over at Arches National Park, but it's really cool in its own right. And it's got cool vistas that you can see through the arch. So that's a very popular place for people to take pictures. Apparently it's a popular place at sunrise. We did not get up for sunrise to go see that, but heard it's pretty popular. And then there's also something called Upheaval Dome. And that's an interesting rock formation where they're not sure if it was due to a meteorite or it was due to like a salt mine that collapsed. But either way, it's this like indentation in the earth. And so when you hike up, you are looking down at that indentation. And that was, like I said, a little less than a mile. Both were a little less than a mile round trip. So I would stop and check out those even if you only have a couple hours here at the park, because those were two things that were well worth doing.
Yeah, and I would say Mesa Arch was an easier hike than Upheaval Dome. And Mesa Arch, the way it's a loop, and so you need to do the whole loop, which I would recommend doing because you see things along the way. Or they have it set up so you could go out and back on just half of the loop. It's not ADA accessible easy, that kind of easy, but it was a pretty easy hike, small elevations, that kind of thing.
They've got some built-in rock stairs for you.
Yes.
Path is marked.
And, it's going to be busy at times. It's a popular place to take photos. So bring your patients with you and help each other out, getting your photos and getting them done and getting out of the way. The hike out we went to First Overlook at Upheaval Dome. That's actually a much longer trail. But the First Overlook, that one is a little more steep, a little more rocky. I think it's a little harder trail to do than Mesa Arch. Not terrible.
No, but we did meet a couple that said if you're going to the second overlook or beyond, it's less than well marked. And so you have to watch for your rock cairns and kind of pick your way across the boulders a little bit. So we didn't end up doing that because of our time, but I think they said, yeah, you're a little bit more wildernessy out there.
And I think, like with most hikes, the further you go, the better your views. But I thought First Overlook was nice. It gave you a really good overview of what had possibly happened there, and you get to see it and get some pictures. So that was really neat to see that. But I wanted to mention that. I will say, even though they're each like half a mile or less out, half a mile or less back, bring water. I mean, we were here in September. It's still hot. It's in the 90s here. You were in the desert.
Yeah.
In fact, and you're up on a mesa. There's no natural water source. So here at Dead Horse Point State Park, for example, they really get on you about limiting water. When you're at the sites, it's electric only. There's no water and sewer at the site, although there is a dump station. But that's because they have to truck water in from Moab. One of the signs I was reading here, they said they bring it in trucks 6,000 gallons at a time because there's no natural water source up here. So they have to bring it in. And that's just something to keep in mind.
Well, I mean, and that's a little bit about this area too, not to sort of go on a tangent, but the Colorado and the Green Rivers are both right here, but they are 2,000 feet below the top of this mesa. I mean, over centuries, they have carved themselves that deep. And so in parts, you can't even see the river because you're so far up. And that's part of the issue up here is the only natural water source is 2,000 feet below you, and it does not come up. So yes, conserving water is a big deal, and bringing your own water is a big deal.
Yeah, and we always talk about hat, sunscreen, water, but in particular, I have found in Utah, even the shortest hikes, when it's hot out, yeah, it's a dry heat, but you know what? So is an oven. And if tell the turkey on Thanksgiving, don't worry, it's a dry heat. It's still going to cook while it's in there, and you will cook in Utah.
The ground is out to kill you, as we've learned. And so, yes, it is very dry.
Everything the sun touches is going to be blazing hot, and it's going to get to you, so bring water. You mentioned Mesa Arch being great for sunrises. If you're not an early riser, like this one, and you want to do a sunset at Canyonlands, the Green River Overlook is a really easy one to drive out to, and it's got some really nice views. And we got the bonus last night of being on the right day where we got to hear a ranger give a talk about some of what was going on here at Canyonlands.
When we get to the visitor center, there's always a little plaque that says what programs are throughout the day. And I saw that there was one last one at the end of the day by Ranger Jessie. And I said, oh, of course we have to go. And she spells her name correctly. So that was a bonus. And so we kind of based our entire trip or quick trip around the park based on wanting to be at that Green River Overlook at 7:00 for her talk. And it worked out perfectly because then we were right there at sunset, which is one of the places in the park that you want to be at sunset. And she gave us a really nice program about a story of the first two women who were able to navigate the Colorado and the Green Rivers. And so that was really interesting. And it turns out that these women were from the University of Michigan. So we're very familiar with that, being from Michigan. And so it was just kind of a fun way to end our day and to learn some history of the park and learn the history of this area. So if you get a chance to stop at the ranger station and check out those programs, find out when they are. Those are always really informative. We've learned a lot by attending the ranger programs in the national parks.
I would mention that happened in the 1930s, and just to put a fine point on it as she did, those were the first two non-native women who had gone down those rivers. Obviously, this area had a huge native and indigenous population, and people have been using this area and using these rivers for centuries, long before the settlers all came out here and found it, right. This area.
This is very true. And the reason for their trip, not to go deep into this, but it was really interesting, they were botanists. And so the reason for their trip was to learn about and catalog, find whatever botanists do related to all the plants out here. And they said, she was telling the story about how, it wasn't this pretty flora and fauna flowers, it was things like cactus. And so they were having, risk life and limb down the Colorado River to find and collect cactus with all their spines and then try to put them in their botany press and then carry and send them back home. So it was a fascinating story about all the things that these women went through and how all the men didn't think they could do it. And the newspaper headlines were, horrid towards the women. And then the very end, it was like this one gentleman who thought he was all that and more was like, oh, well, the women were clearly more capable than the men. So they totally changed everybody's minds about what women were capable of. And they got a lot out of it from a botany perspective too. So really cool story.
And I think what that shows is we only spent about 4 hours in Canyonlands, right? And yet we saw a lot of beautiful things. We learned some history, and a lot of that had to do with stopping at the visitor center, talking to rangers. This is what they're here for. Help them guide you, or have them guide you to figure out what the best stops are for you along the way if you only have a few hours or if you're here for a few days.
While we were only able to spend a few hours here at Dead Horse Point State Park and Canyonlands National Park, we heartily recommend both of them and to make sure that they're on your list. I know a lot of people come to Arches. I'm sure everybody comes here to Canyonlands too, based on the sign outside the entrance gate that said an hour wait from this point. And I was quite floored by that sign. We drove right in. There was nobody else. But I think this does get really busy. And so I should make sure that it is on your list when you come to this area.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to come back here and spend some more time, and I think you should try to spend some time at Canyonlands National Park and Dead Horse Point State Park. In the meantime, keep on trekking.
And we'll see you out there.